I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of climate change. Our carbon emissions increase the thermal insulative properties of the atmosphere, and everywhere is getting hotter, drier, and stormier as a result. We use more energy every year, resulting in a current warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial temperatures. And we're already seeing some of the impacts, humanitarian, ecological, and economic, that result from our reckless use of fossil fuels. There are, of course, many things we can do to scale back our emissions heavily, especially in the industrial and 1%er areas, those which produce the most emissions globally and per capita. What I want to talk about today, though, is a bit different. We've been fed propaganda, proclaiming that we can just innovate and buy our way out of this without changing our habits. Buying electric cars will fix this. The problem is, most of the world isn't designed in a way that facilitates emissions-friendly living. Electric cars don't and won't solve climate change. Many people hail the electric car as a solution to climate change, touting zero-emissions transport without the need to change your habits or lifestyle. The truth of the matter is, electric cars are better for the environment. During their operation cycle, they produce less of the global warming emissions than an equivalent fossil fuel-powered car. However, electric cars and their infrastructure are still carbon-intensive, ecologically harmful drags on our emissions targets. And the problem is, they're still cars. Cars are a very, very inefficient method of transportation. They weigh a lot. Depending on the car, they can weigh more than 8,500 pounds, 40 to 60 times more than a reasonable person's weight. If you've done even the most basic physics, or even, pushed a thing, you know heavier things are harder to move. They take more energy to get moving. Cars inherently are inefficient. They use pneumatic rubber tires which contribute to rolling resistance, sit idle while their owners are at work or home, carry most often one passenger, along with 85% metal and glass. The issue with moving to electric cars is that they still run on an inefficient platform, especially compared to the emissions per passenger distance of even buses and light rail, not to mention walking and biking. In addition to the pure inefficiency of cars, electric cars come with some greenhouse gas issues of their own. The material complexity of an electric car is far beyond that of a conventional one. In particular, the manufacture of batteries for use in electric cars is a carbon-intensive and ecologically destructive process. According to information from MIT, for every ton of the primary component of batteries, lithium, about 15 tons of CO2 are emitted. A relatively standard EV sedan costs between 2 and 16 tons of CO2 in lithium alone, not including the emissions from the high-temperature manufacturing and the electric power required to create the batteries, significant amounts of which are often coal power, a fuel worse than gasoline. For comparison, an average car emits about 1 ton of CO2 every 2,500 miles. And according to the University of Michigan, the 50 to 70% on-road emission savings of EVs closes this gap in around 1.5 years for the average sedan and sedan electric vehicle counterpart. Carbon emissions from production and continued carbon emissions from charging are bad, but not as bad as that of a gasoline car. Generally, we're heading in the right direction with our use of electric cars, right? Wrong! There's another growing issue in the US, parallel to climate change, that poses a threat to our emissions. Cars in the US are getting bigger. In the US and much of North America, larger cars are seeing and have seen, for the last 2 decades, increased sales, higher production, and favoritism by manufacturers, advertisers, and lawmakers. In 2022, SUVs and trucks made up more than 80% of new car sales in the US. The genesis of the SUV class is based on the classification of light truck they're given. This classification means that they can evade emission standards meant for consumer commuter vehicles and tack on a bit of extra weight, power, and capability. All of these things are absolutely disastrous to the efficiency of the SUV. More weight makes it harder for the car to move, more power makes the engine less efficient, and the all-wheel or four-wheel drive SUVs and trucks are given is horrible for efficiency. SUVs and trucks are also more dangerous for everyone both in and outside of the vehicle. But if I were to speak my mind on that, a video would drag on even longer than it already will. The relatively recent boom in truck and light truck sales is bad for our climate goals and bad for the cause of EVs. We're now applying the design principles and philosophy of the big car boom to the EV market, making electric cars a worse-fitting bandage for climate change. In 2023, General Motors announced that it would discontinue the production of Chevrolet Bolt, one of the US market's smallest EVs, and a bestseller for GM. Discontinuation of the Chevy Bolt aims to shift resources to the production of larger, more expensive, and more carbon-intensive e-SUVs and e-trucks. Larger SUV and truck-type EVs have larger batteries, heavier bodies, and all-wheel or four-wheel drive, almost defeating the purpose of electrification with production and use emissions alone. According to the University of Michigan, an electric SUV can take up to an extra 6 months of driving to recuperate its CO2 deficit in comparison to the EV sedan and its conventional counterpart. This doesn't sound bad until you look back at the sales figure. More than 80% of US car sales are SUVs and trucks. Additionally, catching up to the emissions of a conventional car doesn't mean a positive effect on the environment. For a year or two, their impact on the environment is equal to or greater than that of a conventional car. The trend we're seeing, not only with the discontinuation of the Chevy Bolt, but also with the popularity of vehicles like the e-Hummer, Cybertruck concept, and Rivian SUV, may be more destructive to the climate than just staying with low-emissions small gas cars. One of the real solutions we can take with climate change is in our cities. According to United Nations Climate Change, cities account for about 2/3 of energy consumption worldwide and about 70% of emissions, making them a key point where we can lower our carbon impact. A city's carbon impact is invariably linked to its design. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, areas with low-density urban structure use more energy per resident than equally populous areas in inner-city zones, where density is higher. The energy use of suburban areas is shocking. According to information from the American Chemical Society and the 2020 US Census, while the suburban population accounts for less than 1/5 of the US, they produce half of the household emissions. Such a discrepancy in household emissions is for a host of reasons. According to information from UC Berkeley, carbon emissions in suburban areas can be up to double that of average, and 4 times more than that in urban core areas. Moreover, suburban design discourages use of one's own power to get around. According to the National Library of Medicine and the Organization for World Peace, sprawling suburban design discourages use of one's own power to commute or travel, and encourages use of cars, for many residents necessitating higher carbon impact. Even if someone wanted to bike, walk, or otherwise move around without a car, the design of many suburbs prevents such a feat. Spread out, meandering, dead-ended, and designed to maximize car speed, suburban environments are often hostile or uncomfortable to traverse without a car. Even if someone was dead set on biking, suburban areas are placed far from resources and activity hubs, encouraging and sometimes requiring the use of an automobile. In addition to emissions from less efficient housing design and car-centric street layout, the mere lack of density is also worse for the environment. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the National Library of Medicine, and the Organization for World Peace, low-density areas with more land per person have dramatically more asphalt footprint than a denser, more populous area. More asphalt surface area is associated with habitat destruction, size of urban heat island, street and chemical runoff, and water table starvation. Denser, more walkable design combats all of these problems. When the units aren't surrounded on all sides by open air, they're easier to heat and cool, in addition to the smaller floor area also being more efficient. Denser design also puts people in closer proximity to city centers, which encourages biking, walking, and public transportation as modes of transport, and leaves more space for the rest of nature to be there, sequestering more carbon for us. Also, with denser design, the less concrete area of the city reduces the urban heat island that is created, which further lowers cooling costs. The other element of climate-friendly urban design is walk and bikeability. A walkable area is one where the design around streets, resources, and cars is accommodating of pedestrians and cyclists. In 2016, Paris citizen Carlos Moreno took note of the amount of public space cars took up in his city, 66% of it in fact. Moreno noted that cars took a disproportionate portion of public space in comparison to the amount of people who used them, only 17%. Moreno proposed then the theory of a 15-minute city, a city in which one can walk or bike from their home to all basic needs in 15 minutes. Not to discredit Carlos Moreno, But the idea of a city designed with pedestrian proximity to resources in mind is nothing new. Though Moreno has done the work of modeling the 15-minute city, for thousands of years, this is how cities were designed. Without cars, people relied mainly on their feet or bikes to retrieve whatever they needed. I've come here to Amsterdam to learn about, observe, and enjoy the benefits of infrastructure designed for people, not cars. In the 50s and 60s, the Netherlands experienced an economic boom in the wake of World War II, and with it came an explosion in car ownership. Of course, that also came with its own problems. In 1971, 3,300 people died in car-related incidents, 450 of them being children, and organizations like Stop de Kindermoord, Stop Child Murder, and the Dutch Cyclists Union reformed, demanding that infrastructure be designed for people, and that places that had been paved over and redesigned for cars be returned to pedestrians. In 1973, in the face of an oil crisis, the Dutch government floated the idea of car-free Sundays, and in 1980 began to implement proper cycling infrastructure. Interestingly, adding a few cycle lanes to some arterial streets doesn't actually affect cycling rates significantly. This is one of the principles of Dutch cycle design. To be effective, it must be interconnected. Another principle of Dutch cycle design is that bikes are fundamentally different than cars. Bikes operate at a more human level than cars. There's no need for messy infrastructure like stop signs when people have time to negotiate their interactions. One more principle of Dutch design is that the cyclists, and also pedestrians, must feel safe. Perceived safety is one of the biggest factors that affects cycling rates, and Dutch design makes sure that safety is of the utmost importance. If the road car speed exceeds 30 kilometers an hour, about 19 miles an hour, Dutch designs will almost always separate the cyclists from cars. Here in Amsterdam, almost all of the bike paths are separated by a concrete median or raised up past the road. This is also true for pedestrians. At crossing, cars often have to step up to the level of pedestrians, rather than pedestrians stepping down into the realm of cars. Induced demand from infrastructure can only do so much. If the Dutch didn't foster the culture they have around riding, it would certainly be a different story. Dutch culture around cycling is what's known as casual culture, where biking isn't even thought of as an abnormal activity. Just as when in the States would think nothing of strapping into a 2-ton metal box and having explosions pull the weight of 85% metal and 15% human, the Dutch think nothing of grabbing a bike and heading to the store, work, local coffee shop, or another's house. The distinction here is the casual cyclist, fiester, just a person on a bike, versus the wheelrenner, one who cycles for sport. Most Dutch cyclists aren't what we define cyclists by back home, but just people who happen to commute by bike. This is an Oma Fiets, translating literally to granny bike. It's closer to what we in the States would call a beach cruiser than a road bike. Swept back bars, upright, cushy seat. I'll make this bike very easy to commute on. It's the favored bike of the Dutch commuter, the fiester. These are serviced rarely, if ever. They're super reliable, super heavy. Runs on extremely simple, reliable roller brakes and a simple drivetrain. The Oma Fiets, the granny bike, is the workhorse of the Dutch commuter, intended to be used forever, every day. Granny bikes are usually referred to as just Fiets, bike. We, in the States, would add on some words like upright bike or beach cruiser, but to them, this is just the bike. This is the wheelrunner Fiets. The road bike, the race bike. It smashes time trials, it does everything. It's not comfortable, my back hurts. But it's the bike you see most commonly in the US, either being ridden by some 50-something man or disassembled on the side of the road. Why are rider demographics and comfort standards for bikes so different? Well, it's because of the infrastructure, again, of course. The infrastructure in the US is such that only people who already feel comfortable with biking, the 50-year-old man, or quite possibly some young 20-something who's racing the cars, are the only ones who feel comfortable riding in our horribly designed bike lanes or completely open 50-mile-an-hour streets. And that means that bikes in the US aren't as accessible. Dutch cycling culture also has another interesting aspect. If you've been paying attention, you'll have seen that very few, if any, of the people here are wearing helmets. Only 0.5% of cyclists here in the Netherlands wear helmets. But the cyclist death rate is the lowest in the world, only 1.1 for every 100 million kilometers cycled. What's the deal? We in the US require helmets for cycling. We put flags to carry across the street. We put all of the blame on the people getting hit by 2 tons of metal, not on the design of our streets, not on the ever-growing weight and deadliness of our cars. Hey, post-video Enzo here. After I wrote the script for this video, I was looking at discourse surrounding bicycle helmets, and I found this. This is the hierarchy of controls. It's what the CDC and OSHA use to plan work environments so that they're as safe as possible. The hierarchy of controls lists methods of worker safety from most effective and most desirable to least effective and least desirable. Firstly is elimination, physically removing the hazard, in this case removing cars from streets, such as a walkable, dense community that is car-free. Secondly would be substitution, replacing the hazard, something like using public transit or all bikes. Next, engineering controls, isolate people from the hazard. Measures such as segregated bike lanes, raised bike lanes, and bollards. Fourth, administrative controls, changing the way people cycle or the way they drive. Lastly, personal protective equipment, most deadly, least effective, most reliant on those in harm's way. Examples include helmets, street crossing flags, and reflective clothing. What I find strange, and maybe a bit terrifying, is that here in the US, the hierarchy of controls for cyclists and pedestrians extends most often only to personal protective gear. As non-motorists, we're told to bundle up or make ourselves seen through the use of helmets and flags and all types of different reflective clothing, in spite of the fact that cars are the main source of pedestrian and cyclist deaths. It stands to reason that a system of safety used to keep workers in private environments protected would also apply to our civic design, regulation, and laws. But that's not the case. Though cars were only recently overtaken by guns as the #1 source of child mortality in the US, most campaigns around car safety regarding children center around actions the child can take. Actions the child can take? The ones we don't trust to do anything in our society? The ones who aren't wielding the 2,000 pounds of metal? What I'm trying to say here is that the culture we have around our streets, our cars, and our design, and the campaigns and methods we put in place, end up blaming people for getting hit by cars, rather than blaming drivers for hitting people. And that the design of our streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, and other public elements is structured in an inherently dangerous fashion. It'll be a while before we can get rid of the ego-toting F-150s and the giant child-killing SUVs. But the least we can do is design our streets, sidewalks, and bike lanes to some basic safety standards, and stop blaming people for getting hit by thousands of pounds of metal. Dutch design is much of the reason why cycling is so safe. Low street speeds, segregated infrastructure, and other elements that don't rely on a plastic hat to stop people from dying all make the Netherlands a much safer place to cycle and walk. In fact, a study conducted in 12 cities found that over the course of 13 years, having segregated cycle infrastructure resulted in a 44% decrease in road user deaths. To be clear, that's not cyclist deaths. That's all road users, pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists all benefited from safer bike infrastructure. Interestingly, the study found that bike lanes of paint alone have no significant effect on safety. Only sufficiently protected bike lanes and good infrastructure have real benefits. In most American cities, using a car less or even not at all is an impossible change for most people to make. American infrastructure is built for, designed by, and ruled by cars. 40 and 50 mile an hour streets, no bike lanes and sidewalks, complete lack of or underfunding of bus, heavy rail, and light rail infrastructure, and suburbs miles away from city centers where people do things, all make living car-free in the US a laughable fantasy. And it means that only a small percentage of people walk or bike to work, school, or anywhere else. Here in Amsterdam, I'm able to not only travel almost anywhere given the lovely bike and walking infrastructure, but also travel long distance thanks to amazing bus and train routes. Back in the US, I waited more than an hour for a tardy bus, and U.S. Department of Transportation, cars produce about 0.96 pounds of CO2 per passenger month, which is absolutely dwarfed by this tram here at 0.36 pounds of CO2. And the average car is about 77% worse than a heavy rail train at about 0.22 pounds of CO2 per passenger mile. Even a bus, the least efficient public transport method, sports about 0.64 pounds of CO2 per passenger, a huge decrease of about 6. And the emission savings of public transport can grow. At full capacity, an average car makes about 0.24 pounds of CO2 per passenger with 4 people. But heavy rail goes down to 0.1, an 89.6% savings over just one person in the car. And even buses go down to 0.18, about a 20% loss compared to the one person in a car. Our infrastructure in the US is severely outdated. Here, I'm able to comfortably enjoy and get almost anywhere using the public infrastructure. But due to the lack of funding, public interest, and infrastructure in the US, it's a whole mess. Just the other day, I was here in this bike lane just a couple of blocks out of my school. Cars here can pass my 10 to 15 mile an hour self in excess of 50 miles an hour. Jesus Christ. A speed more than 80 kilometers an hour, and a far cry from the Dutch standard of separating cyclists and pedestrians with concrete once the road speed hits 30 kilometers an hour. If we want people to use the green infrastructure, like bike lanes and pedestrian infrastructure that we have in our country, we need to seriously renovate it so that using it isn't a death sentence. We have a path forward to reduce the emissions of cities. And it's not that every suburbanite buy an e-SUV. Electric cars aren't the perfect cure we make them out to be, especially with current car trends. But public transport just might be. Densification of cities makes them more environmentally and ecologically friendly by reducing travel times, encouraging walking and biking, and reducing urban footprint, among other things. Designing cities to be walkable and bikeable makes them safer, healthier, and less carbon-intensive places. And the US is severely under-equipped to implement changes like these that make cities better, greener places.